What is going on, Diablo 2 fans? Dobrunsky here, and today's video is going to be an interesting one. I want to do a complete breakdown on my feedback for Sunder charms in the PTR for patch 2.5. This has probably been, in my opinion, one of the single biggest changes that D2 has received in the last 20 years, maybe with the exception of the synergy system and rune words. I think it fundamentally changes a lot to do with kind of the core mechanics of the game. So there's a lot of things I want to talk about in this video. I'm actually going to break it down into 8 different sections, but I wanted to stress that I want to use this video as an opportunity to sort of express my feedback, as well as comments that I've seen on YouTube videos, community, Reddit, D2JSP, etc. I'm trying to kind of use this video as a source for everyone to get a chance to provide some feedback, although I do highly encourage you guys to at least fill out the PTR feedback survey for just the changes in general, because if you don't make your voice heard, you can't really complain about the changes after. So I just wanted to use this video as an avenue to kind of give you guys that opportunity. But this video is going to be broken down into 8 different sections. So again, it will be a talking head video, so feel free to minimize it if you just want to listen and do whatever else in the background. The first segment that I want to talk about is power creep. Second is changes to build diversity. 3 is culture shock to the changes in general. 4, potentially tweaking cold mastery and how it works with sundered monsters. 5 is changes that I personally would like to see to the Sunder charms in general. 6 is the gap between caster and melee characters. How has that changed? It's widened. What could possibly be done to address that? 7 is the casual player versus the dedicated hardcore player. And then I'm going to wrap everything up with kind of a miscellaneous thought section. So again, a ton to cover in this video. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. If you could throw a like on this video before we even get started, I really appreciate that to help spread it through the algorithm. With that being said, let's first talk about power creep. So just speaking about power creep broadly, I definitely think that the introduction of these charms has introduced some significant power creep. Now with that being said, I do think that a couple small minor tweaks could completely alleviate the problem, which I will cover in a later portion of this video. But I think that some of the S+ builds have kind of just gotten even stronger. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are focusing on just the Javazon getting it stronger or the Blizzard Sorceress getting stronger, but they're not really looking at other builds like Fire Druid, Fire Sorceress, and even the Freezing Arrow or Immolation Arrow Boazon. They've all taken steps forward, in my opinion, with some of the gear like an Exploding Arrow Boazon with Flickering Flame, Hand of Justice, not encountering any fire immunities. If you could roll Affinity Mercenary, those builds are definitely more powerful. It's just a lot of the focus, in my opinion, is entirely on the S tier builds that have gotten even stronger. But again, fortunately, I think a couple small tweaks, mostly to do with the interaction of low resistance and conviction with sundered monsters, could completely basically reverse any of the power creep that these charms have introduced, but at the same time still allow some of those B tier builds to be a little bit stronger. So build diversity is the next topic that I want to discuss, and I genuinely believe that a lot of builds have taken steps forward, mostly fire, but unfortunately there are a couple builds in the current state that I think are getting left behind. That would be the Hydra Sorceress and the Trapsin, in particular fire traps and lightning and death sentry, with the way that the sundered monster effect doesn't apply to those trap minions. So I definitely think that's a change I would like to see. Again, I'll cover that later on in the video, but I think that fire is probably taking some of the biggest steps forward with Freezing Arrow Boazons, Fire Druids, Fire Sorcerers, etc. will have more purpose and can farm more areas in general. Now I do want to point out that I have seen numerous people state that they either love this change, they love the fact that they can make a Fire Sorceress, they can farm Chaos Sanctuary in addition to the Stony Tombs and Mephisto and Pindle. They just want more areas to farm. While the other kind of opposing argument, which again I'm trying to take all the community feedback into consideration, a lot of people like making specific builds for specific locations, so a Poison Nova Necro for the pits, Javazon for cows and Pindle, Cold Sorcerers for Ancient Tunnels, etc. They like those dedicated characters. Fortunately though, I don't think that Sundered Charms forces you to only make a single character. If you really want to keep making those different niche builds for farming different areas, you can. But at the same time, having Sundered Charms and monsters or whatever, you can have a Fire Druid going through Chaos. So I genuinely believe that with some tweaks to the introduction of these charms, you can still have both playstyles. So I did want to point out that kind of criticism and concern that a lot of the community has expressed, but I think that build diversity has taken a step forward, with the exception of some of those S tier builds becoming even stronger, which I'm going to talk about later, which I think we can kind of address it so that we have more B tier builds, can farm more areas and are a little bit stronger, but then not having S tier become even better. So the next topic that I want to talk about is culture shock. I definitely think that it's very easy to just see something in PTR and be like, oh my god, that is insane. That is just such a huge change from the fundamental like core mechanics of the game. And again, I think that providing feedback is always a good thing, but I do want to point out that when you're testing stuff like perfect gear, it's not necessarily kind of like an ideal representation of what it would be like to sort of build that character up on ladder, if that makes sense. One example would be, I have seen a lot of other content creators and people mention like on forums and stuff like that, like Fire Druid ripping through Ubers, like the game is completely broken. But in reality, that Fire Druid is using crazy gear like a 6-faceted crystal sword, Raven Lore, Phoenix, you know, Torch, Annies, Skillers, etc. You know, maybe Chains of Honor, SOJs, Mage Fist, like a very high-end, powerful geared character could clear Ubers. Is that necessarily the worst thing? Because you currently have a smiter at like, you know, level like 50 can go in with a perfect diamond shield, a source of life tap and crushing blow, and can kill Ubers. Is it necessarily a horrible thing to have like endgame perfectly geared casters take on Ubers? I don't necessarily think it is. The only ramification it has is it sort of takes away kind of like the one thing that Melee had over casters was that they could do Ubers. That's definitely valid criticism or concern, but I don't think that early on the meta is going to shift at all from a smiter. People are still going to use smiters early on because you're not going to be able to walk in with just one cold Sunder charm, horribly geared Blizzard Sorceress and take out Ubers. You won't be able to counteract like the life that they recover. You'll have to get like Fathom, Nightwings, you know, Spirit, Blizzard Ormus Robes, etc., Sunder charm, Skillers. Then you can go in and use that caster character to take out Ubers. So I definitely think that the whole culture shock thing, like definitely things have shifted, but if you actually just take a second to analyze it, in my opinion, might not necessarily be the worst thing ever. Okay, so point number 4, which has caused quite a bit of controversy in the community, and that is the Blizzard Sorceress and how Cold Mastery interacts with Sundered monsters. So there's a couple key points here that I just want to kind of discuss first. The Cold Sorceress didn't actually get stronger in terms of DPS. I want to make that very clear. A Sundered monster and then applying the Cold Mastery to that monster, you're still doing the same damage as you would on a regular monster and then applying your Cold Mastery. It's the reason why if you're playing as a Cold Sorceress, having like, you know, typically it's 17 points in a Cold Mastery, because that will bring the majority of monsters to negative 100 cold res, and you just didn't worry about investing anymore because there wasn't a lot of monsters that would have like 50 or 75 cold res, so you didn't have to go all the way up to negative 50 or negative 75. Now, with the Sundered monsters, with their current interaction with Cold Mastery, if it doesn't change, it is true that you can now kill more monsters, you can break the cold immunity and then have extra points in a Cold Mastery to bring them down to negative 100, but you're not doing more damage. You're still doing the same amount of damage, if that makes sense. Now, definitely, I think that it's still a problem, but I just want to make that very clear. The issue is that a lot of community members have sort of brought up the fact that a Blizzard Sorceress can just farm everywhere now, so you don't need to target farm like Ancient Tunnels or Mephisto. You can just pretty much go wherever you want to. Now, I think that this could be alleviated via 2 methods. The one I'm a little bit hesitant to suggest because I definitely think it has extra ramifications. I'll get to that later. But the first would be just having Cold Monsters, or excuse me, just having Cold Mastery apply at 1/5 efficiency to Sundered monsters. So if you have negative 100 res, like say 17 points, and you have a 95 cold res Sundered monster, it applies at 1/5 efficiency, so you're only bringing them down to 75 cold res. So you'll be able to damage them, you just won't run through them. So I think that is probably the simplest and easiest kind of like way to address Cold Mastery. Now, I don't know on the coding end of things if that's a nightmare, but that's definitely a simple way to kind of address the main issue, at least I think it is. The second point that I've seen brought up on numerous occasions from other content creators in the community is flipping Cold Mastery so that it does plus skill damage instead. This would completely alleviate the issue. The only concern that I have is Terror Zones were already a pretty big change, and then Sundered Charms is another big, massive change. Flipping Cold Master around is another big, huge change where I feel like you're a little bit better off just taking the 1/5 efficiency approach, kind of letting the dust settle, seeing how it plays out for a season, and then addressing it later if it's really like a big issue. Now, I do want to point out one cool idea about flipping it to plus cold skill damage is that I think you'll see a lot of endgame cold sorceresses use the rune word Doom, which is very interesting. For those who don't know, that's a very expensive rune word that has plus 2 to all skills, negative cold res, and a holy freeze aura. Typically, that was always a useless rune word for cold sorceresses because of cold mastery, but if it was flipped to do plus damage, you would see a lot of people using this weapon endgame. Definitely think that flipping it to plus damage, that would definitely affect like Moat Tricking Mephisto and Magic Finding early on as a Blizzard Sorceress. Again, some people might be for that or against that, but that's kind of like the flip of just making that massive change. It would definitely solve the Sunder monster issue, but it's going to cause other, I don't want to say issues, but it's just going to have a ripple effect with other components in the game. So that's kind of like my thoughts. I think just tuning full mastery so that it works at 1/5 efficiency would be the best approach. But if you have any other feedback, just please let me know in the comment section below. So moving on to what I think is probably the most important section of this video is changes that I have / changes that the community has proposed to address Sunder charms in general. Now, the first change that I would like to see is lower res and conviction only working at 1/5 efficiency against Sundered monsters. So what I think this effectively does is it still keeps that kind of like endgame gear push and reward there. So if you're playing as a fire druid and you have affinity, you're going to take a Sundered monster that has 95 res. It's only going to bring him down to like 75 res. Then if you stack, eventually once you get the gear, Raven Lore, Fire Faceted Sword, Phoenix, etc., you'll bring them down to, you know, probably just slightly into the negatives. So you will do decent amount of damage, but you're not going to run through them like a negative 100 fire res monster, because in that case, it's sort of like it eliminates the harsh halt of not being able to do damage to an immune monster, but it still keeps that gear progression and push to sort of keep getting better and better gear to do more and more damage. You're not just applying negative 86 res, I think level 12 conviction has. So you're not just instantly bringing a Sunder monster below 0 and then stacking more negative res, so you're just going to steamroll them. It's going to kind of keep the feeling of a fire immune monster. It's just going to kind of become fire resistant, if that makes sense. I think that would be a better balancing approach than just allowing them to work at full efficiency. The second change that I would like to see is a varying role on the charm, so similar to Geed's Grand Charm. Idea about Geed's Grand Charms is kind of like a chase item, right? You want to get better magic find, better vendor reduced prices, and better gold. Wouldn't it be cool if Sunder charms had a varying negative penalty? So like negative 75 to negative maybe like 125 or something. So if you find a really bad charm, negative 120, you're really going to be penalized. But then you can keep identifying fired Sunder charms and keep trying to get a better one and a better one and a better one, because its current state, just one flat negative 75 res roll. As soon as you get your first fire Sunder charm, that's it. Every other one, unless you're planning on making like multiple fire characters, I mean, even in that scenario, you can still move it between your shared stash. It just loses its value. So I think that's a good way to keep it as a chase item and adding continued value. It's just adding a varying roll to the negative res penalty. And the third change is an adjustment to the melee charm. In its current state, it's not super beneficial because the majority of physical immunes can be broken with Reaper's Toll already. So if you compare like fire damage dealing elemental character with Infinity, the issue prior to this patch was that you couldn't break many fire immune monsters. But with physical damage, you can typically break almost all immunities with a Reaper's Toll mercenary. So having that immunity to fizz damage reduced isn't very beneficial. While at the same time, that increase of 25% damage you're taking, that is super hard to overcome as a melee character. Like that in itself is going to neuter melee characters in hardcore entirely. So I would suggest trying to tweak that, like maybe turning that extra percent damage you receive, maybe 5% instead of 25%, and maybe making the charm apply like physical pierce to make it a little bit more appealing. So if it had like maybe negative 25% pierce, or that might be too much. Just say like maybe like negative 15% enemy physical pierce. It would benefit both ranged and melee, and then only having that 5% increased damage would make it less of a detriment, because as it currently stands, it's very easy to stack extra lightning, cold, or fire res or poison res for the other Sunder charms, but it's very hard to stack physical DR. There's not a lot of sources of fizz DR. So that would be sort of an adjustment that I would kind of like to see for melee characters. But again, guys, if you have any other feedback, please let me know in the comment section below. But I think that those 3 minor tweaks would be a really good starting point to sort of adjust Sunder charms. So the next topic is the gap between casters and melee. This has been brought up and we kind of just touched on that with sort of suggestions to tweak the melee charm, but that gap is now widened. It was already there, but now that caster characters in the current state can do like Ubers, it's become an even wider gap, with really the only reason to run a melee character now is, in my opinion, if you want to play the build, a Hork Barb or a Smiter for Ubers. Other than that, pretty much in every scenario, some sort of caster build is going to be better. So there's definitely a big inherent like disparity that's even bigger now. Now, I do think that a couple things could be tweaked to adjust that disparity, but I personally would rather just see sort of like the ladder move forward and then maybe address it later. Like at this point, we kind of just got to push and get the ladder started. But with that being said, you could make some maybe tweaks to monsters' Fizz, Res, and Hell difficulty, possibly add splash damage, and again, maybe introduce some of those changes to the melee Sunder Charm. That would kind of address the gap and sort of close it up, in my opinion. So the second last topic that I want to mention is the casual player base versus the dedicated player base. Before I even get into it, I want to mention that it is impossible to please everybody. You're never going to have a community that plays like 10 hours a week agree with item accessibility, room word accessibility, you know, power creep, compared to elitists that play like 10 hours a day. It's never going to happen. Now, with that being said, I genuinely believe that if you apply the 1/5 efficiency of low res and conviction to Sunder Charms, it is the best of both worlds. So if a casual player gets a Ravenlore and a Fire Sunder Charm, he could then move into Chaos Sanctuary with a Fire Druid, have some fun, clear some monsters, not be stonewalled. But at the same time, the player that really wants to excel and kind of grind out all that insane gear, you still have the headroom to get the 6 Fire Faceted Crystal Sword, Fire Faceted Ravenlore, Phoenix, an Infinity Mercenary, I don't know, maybe self-wield a Plague Crystal Sword or something. You can chase down that super expensive gear to slowly bring those monsters' res down to the, you know, negative 20, 30 range and do even more damage, but at the same time, you kind of avoid that steamrolling effect that we've sort of seen in PTR. So I genuinely believe that that 1/5 efficiency rule, if we can apply that to Sundered monsters, it will appeal to both the casual player base as well as the dedicated player base. So I want to wrap up this video by covering some miscellaneous thoughts that I have about Terror Zones and Sunder Charmed in general, and sort of the direction that the game is taking. Now, I definitely think that this is PTR, right? So now's the time to provide feedback. Values can change, nothing is set in stone. But I genuinely believe that Terror Zones and the introduction of these charms is a step in the right direction. It shifts up the meta of Hamberdons, Lightning Sorceresses, and Javazons and Smiters, only farming Chaos Sanctuary, Bale, Mephisto, you know, and Pindle. You can now run through the jail cell with a Fire Druid, or Flare Jungle with a Fire Sorceress, or there's just numerous areas and new build possibilities. So I definitely think that's a good thing and just breaks up and shifts up the meta. Again, I know a lot of people disagree, but a lot of people also agree at the same time, because I did throw out a community poll that has about, I believe at the time recording this video, almost 7,900 votes, where 53% agree that they like the direction of the changes, 27% would like to see some tweaks, 7% don't care, they just want the ladder to start, and 13% think that the changes are too much of a shift from the core mechanics of Diablo. So if you put your finger, like checking the pulse of the D2 community, I think that a lot of people think it is moving in the right direction. But again, just use the comment section below as an opportunity to voice some extra feedback. Hopefully some of the ideas from this video and some of the ideas that you guys have suggested in forums and, you know, feedback polls and surveys or whatever, hopefully it makes it into the game. Worst case scenario, Season 2 launches. If we really don't like it, the dust settles, changes can be made for Season 3. But that basically wraps up everything that I want to cover, guys. I know it was a long video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I had it timestamped so you could bounce around. But again, if you could throw a like on it, that'd be awesome. Help spread it through the algorithm. And I'll catch you guys on my next video or live stream. Peace out.